Welcome, everybody, to the second session of our 8-week course on digital Catholic social teaching. I really want to thank all of you for your participation in what is an experiment on multiple levels. As you probably have noticed, Shrikant and the rest of us working on this project have already put a great deal of material online for your consideration. In addition to the video, there are excellent notes being supplied by our colleague Peter Berkman. There is a bibliography. Video actually has been indexed to a degree. We're going to continue to work on this. It is our view that we're tasked to come up with literally a new medium for dealing with these very far-ranging topics. So your contributions to this are enormously important. So once again, thank you very much. What we're going to do today is going through a series of materials that, while they have, of course, been completely public, and to some extent, they have been publicly discussed, this is actually a kind of a whole hidden layer of how the Church approaches these topics, which you may be surprised to hear are not very well known by Catholics. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the people who are familiar with this material are others who have been working on similar projects and been referred to this. I'm going to actually go through 5 encyclical letters at a relatively quick pace today. This could be, in each of these topics, much longer and much more detailed. But what we're really trying to accomplish here, with your help, is designing an approach for self-learners. We're trying to give you jumping off points for how you might deepen your own understandings, how you might educate yourself about these matters. Fortunately, we live in a world in which all of these materials are available to anybody. And maybe some of the connections between the dots will be helpful as a guidepost for you. But in the end, it's really going to be up to you to dig into these materials and come up to your own conclusions. Can we see the first slide, please? Okay. We've organized all of this in terms of questions. This has been Shrikant's observation after many hundreds of these sessions, that getting questions on the table is the most important task, because a question then allows you to then do your own research, figure things out for yourself, make your own connections. And so this is not a lecture in the traditional sense at all, particularly since we will, after I get done going through these slides, we'll have a long session of Q&A and back and forth and dialogue, structured dialogue to be sure. But we're looking for ways to increase that dialogue process. So question number 1, and this is picking up on where we left off last week. Why did Pope Leo XIII bring back St. Thomas Aquinas? And this was specifically in an encyclical published in an encyclical letter, which is what popes do, how they communicate their the Church's views on issues of the day, mostly. Aeterni Patris is the first of the 5 encyclicals that we're going to be discussing. All of these are available in many languages. I think they're not official unless they're in Latin, but the English version, Spanish version, pick your language. It's all available on the Vatican website. Plus, there are often Wikipedia pages and so forth about this. So tomorrow happens to be, the Catholic Church has a long list of saints, of course, and they tend to have their own days devoted to them. Often, since there's many more than 365 saints, often there are 2 or 3 on the same day. Tomorrow, Monday, the 7th, happens to be Thomas Aquinas's feast day. So this is quite timely for us to be talking about this here. What happened as a result of this is that in the category of saints, there is a much more select group known as doctors of the church. And until this encyclical was published, Aquinas was known as the angelic doctor. What happened with this is he got elevated, so to speak, and so he became, if you want, the class president. He became the common or universal doctor. Now, why did Leo have to do this? And I won't go through the details, except merely to note that Aquinas has not always been, and in particular today, is not necessarily at the center of the conversation. 2 years ago, when I was researching this, I started asking people, if you went as an undergraduate to one of the many colleges in Rome, and there are quite a few of them, would Aquinas's work be taught? The answer is, in general, no, it would not be today in Rome. How about as a graduate student? He decided to pick up on all of this. He decided to take the universal doctor, Aquinas. Same problem. In fact, he has been, to some extent, shunted to the side. I suspect that that is a very specific problem of the television environment, which we'll also talk about a bit. We're no longer in that environment. We're now digital. So the opportunity for all of us to reacquaint ourselves with the work of Aquinas. Aquinas was a 13th century theologian. He was born into a noble Italian Neapolitan family. He was, they were in fact warriors, knights, if you will. And he was the son who decided he did not want to go and fight. He didn't want to be dragged into war situations. And given current events, I can imagine that many of you would understand that. But in fact, he did wind up getting into a fight. And that fight turns out to have revolved largely around the retrieval of the work of Aristotle. So as you no doubt recall, Aristotle was the student, Plato was the teacher, and the differences between them, depending on who you read, and there's a vast literature on that topic, either the differences were colossally important and fundamental, or they were superficial and could easily be ignored. Fact of the matter is, both Aristotle and Plato's original works were lost for many, many centuries. Part of the reason for this, if you're familiar with European scholarship, of course, is that material that was written on papyrus, which is to say pounded down plant leaves, didn't survive very well. But as it turns out, papal encyclicals were still officially issued on papyrus until the 12th century, century before Aristotle. But it was a shift over to skins, vellum in particular, which has much more durability. So there's a big hole, so to speak, of original materials. What happened in the 13th century is that Aristotle was broadly rediscovered, and that actually was thanks to Islamic scholars. In fact, eventually so was Plato. So the ability to contrast student and teacher, and I would say their most important difference, if you wish to delve into this, is on the topic of forms. Aristotle has a view of forms that is quite different from Plato, and forms are crucial because what human beings do subconsciously is they recognize forms. But that's the Aristotelian view. The Platonic view, related, is that we are born knowing these forms, but the challenge becomes one of remembering. And this distinction winds up being enormously important over time. Thomas Aquinas, because he taught at the University of Paris on two separate stretches, because he produced many millions of words in his work. He's one of the few people who had the opportunity to live long enough and be concentrated enough to write summaries or collections of works. And so therefore there are two summas, most importantly the Summa Theologica, which has been described as having 38 treatises in it, thousands of articles. It's not the sort of thing you start and sit down and read as your bedtime reading. It tends to be the sort of thing that you go to as a reference work on topics that you want to discuss. There are many summaries, also the summas, but this is all very accessible material. What happened as a result of Pope Leo XIII, bringing him back and elevating him to president of the senior class, was a whole new field known as Neo-Thomism or Neo-Scholasticism, grew up in the 20th century. Now, I'm not going to belabor this except to say that this transition under modern electric conditions did not go so well. And indeed, you'll hear this described in a variety of fashions, but there are many who believe they can categorize the responses to this into 5 or 10 or more different versions of Aquinas. So since the medieval sensibility that Aquinas had written with, and in fact, Aquinas had many contemporaries, probably most importantly, Bonaventure, but many others, that entire world became more and more distant, became more and more hard and difficult to access. And so the 20th century version of Thomas Aquinas branched off in many different directions. And the whole thing wound up being quite contentious. In other words, Pope Leo XIII attempted to bring back Aquinas, but in many significant ways he failed. One of the more important aspects of how he failed, so it could be summarized that the Summa Theologica described 3 fundamental topics: reality, humanity, and the divine. It turns out that the description of humanity, which we will dwell on quite a bit next week and the week after that, the 2 sessions following this, which will be on human dignity, one of the 3 pillars. So just to remind you, Catholic social teaching is based upon human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity. And so what we're going to do after today's continuing context is give you 2 weeks on each of those 3 subjects, adding up to a total of 8. What was lost as a result of this very difficult modern attempt to recapture a medieval sensibility is that the topic of human psychology was dropped. In particular, at this moment, 1879, we talked last week at some length about how everybody was piling on against the church. This meant that colleges were no longer functioning. This meant that the training of priests became more and more difficult. And one of the very few places where psychology was being taught in a Catholic university was in Louvain, Belgium. And so the individual who was selected, elevated to lead this exploration, he was not Leo's first choice. The person that Leo chose to go to Louvain was rejected. And the man who was put in his place, Desiree Mercier, who ultimately became a cardinal and a fairly important character after Leo, he did not want to put faculty psychology in. And so next week when we do, and the week after that, human dignity, we will drill down on the topic of faculty psychology. But that's one of the significant failures as a result of Leo's effort. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do here and in a number of subsequent slides is just to give you summaries of the other 4 encyclicals beyond Aeterni Patris that are the substance and basis of anyone who wishes to look at these things in any detail. In 1891, same Pope, Leo XIII, published an encyclical titled in Latin. The first couple of words in Latin is the official name, but they have subtitles. And in this case, the subtitle was The Rights and Duties of Capital and Labor. So just think about this. Send yourself back 130 years. Think about the kind of situation that was going on at that point, particularly with socialist organizing, with labor unions organizing, with all sorts of conflict. People were dying on the barricades, so to speak. And therefore, the rights and duties of both capital and labor would have been a front page topic, so to speak. It's very important here that it's rights and duties. So we've come to think of rights, human rights and so forth, as not carrying any responsibilities with them. That is not likely to persist as we go forward, because the granting of a right really should carry with it some sense of obligation. What are you supposed to do with this? What are you supposed to do with the freedom that you get? And so what you have here in Rerum novarum is the establishment of the beginnings of Catholic social teaching. The points that I've listed here are, in summary, the highlights of what Leo had to say. The church has a moral obligation to speak out on social issues. That would not have been the case in such an overt fashion before this. In fact, the assaults, the controversies, the calamity, really, that the church found itself in, excluded them from this. So Leo was really stepping out in doing this. Furthermore, his insistence that the market must be tempered by moral concerns should indicate to you that something unusual is going on here. There are aspects of this, I guess, you could find in today's investment world. And I suspect that ESG and so forth are only going to become more and more pronounced and probably transition from an ethical to more of a moral basis. So What he said is that labor has a moral responsibility, a duty to perform what they have agreed to do and to remain nonviolent about it. Secondly, capital has a moral responsibility to provide that work and respect the dignity of the workers. This question of dignity becomes very important, particularly as we get into the 20th century and we start talking about Marxism and beyond. And the state is worked into this as necessarily mediating, providing the common good across the labor and capital. Now, this is not the notion of the state, perhaps, that most of us have grown up with. I can well understand if there are people here who have quite negative views about the role of the state. But all of those kinds of positions were something that Leo was trying to supersede. So if there's one idea I'd like to drive home here, and we'll see how this emerges from the rest of the slides, is that this is neither political left wing or political right wing. In fact, we're dealing here with the common good, which is far more fundamental than those political positions, including libertarian and so forth. Next slide, please. So here I'm stepping back a little bit. I don't know how many of you have heard the term distributism. It was, in the English-speaking world, a pretty hot topic, particularly in the 20s and 30s of the 20th century. G.K. Chesterton may be a name some of you are familiar with. Hilaire or Hilary Belloc may be another name. And as it turned out, particularly in the UK, where a lot of this was being discussed, probably more so than in other language blocks, Chesterton and Belloc were largely in your face. They were ubiquitous. In particular, they had a dynamic duo that they went up against, H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw. These were figures associated with Fabian socialism, not the same as Marxism, but wherever you turned, on the radio, in public presentations, in magazines, in books, you would see these dueling points of view. So Chester Belloc is obviously a pushing together of two people's names. I think Shaw is the one who made that assignment. These were very important characters, particularly, as I say, in the English-speaking Catholic world. So what is the Servile State? Servile State is a fabulous book. I remember traveling to Tokyo 2 years ago, having my friend there asked me if I was familiar with this. Apparently the Japanese translation, or a new translation in Japanese, was only accomplished a few years ago. And so if there's one document on the basis of distributism I would ask you to look to, it would be the Servile State. What has happened, of course, is that many of these things have become public domain. And so the public domain character of this makes it easy, even easier under digital conditions to access this. So if you're curious, if you'd like to educate yourself, it's not going to cost you much, except for your time and effort. The notion that there is a social market economy, again, pushes together these various ideas. And so you can imagine what's going on here. This is early 20th century. You're dealing with many rival presentations. You're dealing with many people who are proposing how they want to correct all the mistakes of particularly Western society. And so distributism was initially, but not consistently, a Catholic response where communism, Marxism, fascism, and a whole long list of isms were the other alternatives. If I were to cite one thing for you as the kind of organization associated with distributism, it would be cooperatives. I had no idea what I was doing when I was a young graduate student in Madison, Wisconsin, except that I wound up founding a cooperative. It was a bicycle store. It still exists, called Yale Jersey Bicycle Co-op. So you might also recognize that agricultural states like Wisconsin, particularly with Scandinavian populations, cooperatives were quite popular. So I had no idea that I was in fact doing distributism when I just thought I was echoing what was being done all around me in the cheesehead economy. Another touchstone that may stimulate some further research on your part is Dorothy Day's Catholic worker movement. And so she was a very accomplished organizer. She played Pied Piper to quite a group of folks. There were newspapers, magazines, many books. This is one of these areas where you can dig into it quite deeply, but I'll just note for you, when Pope Francis visited the United States, and in particular, when he appeared in New York City and was praising the United States, Dorothy Day was an American. And so this is an American movement that Francis had a great deal of good things to say about. And maybe at some point we can do a meetup with a modern adherent, a friend of mine, Larry Chapp, on the Catholic worker movement. Next slide, please. So what does the church mean by the reconstruction of the social order? This is a subtitle to the next encyclical that I'll be briefly describing. The Pope in this case was Pius XI. He is 1920s, 1930s. In 31, he published Quadragesimo anno. It translates, of course, as 40 years. It's the 40th anniversary. So 1891, 1931. So what you see us going on here is that Leo was not forgotten. Leo was not simply set aside, but rather continued over and over again, well into the late 20th century, and in many ways here into the 21st with Francis. So this is an encyclical. In fact, it is my favorite of the three main encyclicals that I'll be discussing today. But what you're dealing with here is a much more focused effort against all of the developments that had happened over those 40 years. And so the notion that society had an order, not a chaos, that we're not in a Hobbesian situation, but one where we get, because of our free will, and our freedom allows us to work these topics through. The notion was that the social order had gone out of whack and needed to be reconstructed, particularly along the line, naturally, of a Christian reform of morals. Shrikant's lost the screen here. And you're muted, Shrikant. So.
Sorry about that. Continue. I'll start the screen in a second. There is a problem.
Okay. This notion of a moral order is exactly what you'd expect in the circumstances. But he went so far as to criticize the effects of the printing press, which was the liberal order, which is to say the Enlightenment and beyond, in a way that had never been done before. This is might seem odd to you, and I hope we wind up with some questions about these various environments and how the print environment got a fair amount of focus from Pius XI. He then goes into some great detail about the twin reefs, as he described them, the two possible ways that we can get mistaken and misunderstand the moral order, both the extreme of individualism and the extreme of collectivism. So by the time 1931 happens, of course, we're dealing with a Russian Revolution. We're dealing with a communist international. We're dealing with many proposals on each direction. And from Pius' standpoint, we've lost our moral compass in doing this. He also goes into some great detail about human freedom and its relationship to the state, as well as the crucial topic of the law of charity. So it is for those reasons, along with his more careful definition, if you will, of the three pillars, human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity, the topic of the rest of this course. This is my favorite among the encyclicals I'm talking about today. Next slide, please. The notion that there needed to be some pushback against the Comintern. You might think that this is strictly a Cold War issue. It was not. It was quite evident by the 1930s this was going on. So, for example, Marshall McLuhan, who's very important to the work that we're doing here at the center, when he arrived at Cambridge University in the mid-1930s, not only did he get on a train and go down to London to hear Chesterton talk, and I believe sign up for the organization called the Distributivist League, but he had remarked that you had only really two choices. So this is 1934, 35, Cambridge University. You either became a Marxist or you became a Catholic. And you probably have seen a lot of ways that this is played out, as figures from that time and their work has spilled forward into our lives. But the concentration on what the Bolsheviks had done, the USSR, reminding us in some ways, I guess, we're all getting an education about Russia, probably an education that we didn't ask for, and probably one that is quite distorted for obvious political reasons. But in that time period, this was a very serious issue. As it turns out, the underlying technological environment at that time was radio. And so one of the actions that Pius XI took was to promote Vatican radio. As you probably have noticed, the BBC has put back shortwave broadcasting in order to overcome the internet blockage within modern day Russia. So there are now multiple broadcasts every day of Western news, as the BBC construes it, beamed into Russia. And so the notion that you would use radio to accomplish this sort of instruction, hoping to override all of the competing forms, has become much more complicated now, of course. For a long time, Vatican Radio was the most powerful radio station on earth. But he didn't stop there. He promoted a very wide-ranging program in literature, among other things, that literature effort had contests with prizes, novels were being written, plays were being written, and one of the organizations that came out of that Catholic International in literature was a publication that Marshall McLuhan, here again, wound up being closely associated with. The name of that publication is Renaissance, spelled differently from the way that we typically call Renaissance. It's still published to this day, Marquette University. And in 2011, I guest edited a special issue on McLuhan in that publication. In terms of the larger historic events, the conflict between, if you will, the Catholic International and the Communist International is probably best encapsulated in the Spanish Civil War. And this raises all sorts of political issues here, because what I've told you is that I would like you all to think through the topic of how Catholic social teaching is neither right-wing nor left-wing. And yet things tended to get slippery. And yet things tended to slide into these sorts of conflicts. Spanish Civil War itself, of course, is a very rich topic. I'm sure many of you have read various accounts of it. You may have even picked sides in all of that. But there was a much broader effort, which generally goes under the heading of Catholic action. So what we're dealing with here is something that is neither left-wing nor right-wing, and yet it winds up being very much an aggressive, practical, pragmatic matter. The fascist or proto-fascist organization Action Française was banned in 1926. Pius XI is the one who enacted that ban. So he was in fact fighting against, if you will, the right wing. And yet this becomes quite complicated and historically intertwined with many other agendas going out at the same time. Next slide, please. This is a little bit off the track, if you will. It's not specifically a Catholic social teaching encyclical, but it's one that comes up often in conversations about these topics. This is published actually by Pius XI's successor, Pius XII, who is himself something of a controversial topic, since he was Pope through World War II. Humani, generis, 1950. If you wish to really dig in to the underlying materials here, it's a quite fascinating account. It had, if you will, it was the setup that led to Vatican II. It is rich with discussion of natural law and the role of Aquinas. It is filled with efforts to try to understand how modern science does and does not correspond and align with the natural law perspective. This is a topic that we will be picking up in the latter part of this course much more thoroughly. The broad topic of the relationship between reason and faith, which later becomes fide, faith, et ratio, reason, as an encyclical by John Paul II, actually written by the man who then became Benedict XVI, is also discussed at some length, as is the importance of enduring truths, known in the Catholic world as magisterium, and its relationship to developing events, progress. Is there anything that can be held true across history? And there's also a very interesting effort here to address those within the church who had decided that everybody had gotten themselves all wrapped up in a ball of twine, disagreeing with each other. How the theologians could not actually get together on these critical topics. And so Therefore, there must be an effort to retrieve. This retrieval topic becomes very important for what we're doing now. The question of what digital retrieves, much as the question of what did the previous electric environment retrieve, and what does it mean to return to the ancients. I'll just note here in passing, we'll come back to this topic in some of the later sessions. By the time the printing press had advanced through the 16th and the 17th century, there was a very widespread notion that there was a conflict going on between the ancients and the moderns. This is one that occurs in French literature, it occurs in English literature. And so this effort to return to the ancients, and in particular early days of Christianity, becomes a very important topic. Next slide, please. Let's fast forward here. Centesimus annus, of course, is Latin for 100 years. 1991, the encyclical was issued by Saint Pope John Paul II, or JP2, as we perhaps, being too slangy about this, tend to refer to the fellow. And you all know who we're dealing with now. So Leo XIII, Pius XI, Pius XII, these are quite obscure historic figures. And I can understand if people are unclear why they should care about them. John Paul II, on the other hand, became enormously important, particularly in terms of his engagement in Poland with the effectively the end of the Cold War and the falling of the Berlin Wall. And so here again, we have the church acting in very significant historical terms, very practical, and with major consequences. What John Paul II discussed, briefly summarizing here, and each of these 5 bullet point summaries, I suspect Peter in his notes will have some other things that he wants to highlight. Every one of you, as you hopefully pursue some study in these topics, will probably come up with some other items that you find most important. But here we've got a discussion of the whole notion of a class society and a class struggle in relationship to human dignity. So obviously each of us as an individual deserves dignity. There's a whole series of ways that human beings have organized themselves off of the individual through family into various smaller groupings, cooperatives being a fine example, up through larger and larger and larger. Well, if you blow all this up to the notion that we're living in a class society, and the most important aspect of you as a person is the class. Are you working class? Are you capitalist class? And do you need to fight each other on a class basis? You can see how the individual's human dignity is degraded substantially as a result of that view of the world. Furthermore, the notion that human labor is just another commodity. It might as well be ore that is mined out of the ground. It might as well be other things that are traded on the commodity market, subverts the notion that every one of us expresses a dignity in our work. So you're reducing human beings here to something that is far closer to a cog in a machine. So you think of Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times as an example of what modernity looked like under these circumstances. This subversion of moral dignity necessarily also subverts their morality and leads to a view that there is no free will, that we are, particularly behaviorist psychology, if you will, that we're being driven by desires and instincts. Again, knocking the legs out from underneath human dignity. This gets into a conversation about the right to private property, which is neither a right-wing nor a left-wing consideration. And just to remind you, not just then, but to this very date, socialism is defined by those who profess to be socialists as a situation in which there is no private property. This is carried forward into the political party that AOC has come from. And so that identifying that wing of our current politics as socialist is accurate in many ways. And it further, particularly when it's fully thought through, and certainly if it's implemented, it undermines human dignity. Very important topic, which we'll get into more in the next couple of classes. And then he uses the term false anthropology, that human beings have become just an element of a system. This is relatively recent history, right? My guess is that most people on this call are old enough to remember 1991. 1991, of course, this is the fall of the Berlin Wall. 1991 is the end of history, as some had proposed, incorrectly, as it turns out. And it also winds up being, in many ways, the initiation of the work that we're doing at the center, particularly as regards Sam Huntington. Next question, please. Next and last question. So I'm doing okay here. I'm more or less on time. Thank you very much for your patience. I want to point you to a website, cappusa.org. This is the official website of the US element of an organization that was started in 1993 by John Paul II. Centesimus annus, 100th anniversary, pro pontifis. So this is meant to be a lay, not a clerical organization. And it exists to this day. One of the people who has been very deeply involved with this is named Robert Nalojek. He had to, unfortunately, bow out of joining us today. I was hoping he would come and say a few words, but he's been given the assignment to babysit a grandchild. He'll pick up on us later, but I'm recommending to you, if you wish to know more about this in an official capacity, and there are actually courses that are being taught on this, certificates are being awarded on Catholic social teaching. cappusa.org is the right place to go. I also want to draw your attention to something that is very important to us, another encyclical, and I'm sorry, I should have put the encyclical names in italics for this, so I'll correct that when we publish the slides. Laudato Si, which should also have an apostrophe at the beginning of it, is a Pope Francis encyclical published in 2015. Chapter 3, I'm hoping some of you find interesting enough to go and read. And its title is The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis, beginning in paragraph 101. Let me also draw your attention to an author that has been very important to our research, Romano Guardini. As it turns out, Guardini was to have been the topic of Francis's never completed PhD thesis. In many ways, Laudato Si chapter 3 is the best we have of that PhD thesis, and Guardini is cited repeatedly. For those of you who were with us for the earlier 8-week sessions on 3 spheres, you may recall that I opened and closed each of those sessions with "We no longer live in the modern world." Well, one of the more important books of this era, which I hope some of you find interesting enough to read, is Guardini's End of the Modern World. It's actually published along with another set of lectures, which has the title Power and Responsibility. We, Center for the Study of Digital Life, and in particular, Peter Berkman, who's helping us here with his notes, and many of the rest of us, have devised a dialogue between Marshall McLuhan and Romano Guardini. We're continuing to perfect that, but we intend to bring it and stage it as a drama at the Lateran University towards the end of May in Rome. And I'll just leave, concluding here by citing a couple of things that might pass as slogans, or I can imagine somebody marching down the street almost with a sign that asserts one or another of these things. It has been our view throughout that the retrieval process, which we're now going through again, since we're in a new paradigm based on digital technology, that what is being retrieved, at least as a sensibility, as a way of structuring our understanding of the world, has a lot more to do with the medieval than it does with the modern. That's why we're no longer in the modern world. That doesn't throw us into a postmodern or a hypermodern or a metamodern, as some have suggested. It actually encourages us to think how the medievals before the printing press would have dealt with these questions. And then lastly, let me just note, there's a topic which is floating around, which we will be doing more work on, particularly in the subsidiarity section. We have 2 weeks coming up on human dignity, then 2 weeks on subsidiarity. You're going to hear a lot more about digital distributism. And with that, let me conclude today's presentation, invite Shrikant back, and move to Q&A. Thank you all very much. You're on mute, Shrikant.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. All right, folks, it's time for Q&A. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask questions. We'll collect all the questions, and then we will go ahead and, Mark will proceed to answer as many of them as we possibly can. And Peter is keeping track of all the questions, so the questions will be there on the web page. So we'll start off with Bob. Bob, go ahead. What's your question?
Hi. It was mentioned that I don't really know where this question belongs, but it was mentioned that the church has an obligation to speak on social issues. Where would I ask about how the Catholic Church relates to population control? I realize that's very specific. It's not.
Sure. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Chris. Joe.
Thank you again for joining us, Mark. This is a really interesting presentation. I guess that the idea that Catholic social teaching in and of itself is not left or right, but it seems to be the church itself. It seems to have adopted, like, the Catholic liberation theology has been adopted by one side, and other groups have adopted the right side. Why is that? And is there a problem with that going forward with the church?
Good question. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So Joe's question, right or left? Excellent. Next up is going to be Chris. Chris, go ahead.
Hi guys, thanks so much. It's been great to hear the talks on the encyclicals. I'm a convert, and it was these encyclicals that helped me in my process of the conversion. In any case, just to get to the question, seeing as how these encyclicals are tools or mediums for the world in this particular time, do you believe that the church's main role particularly is because it's the best medium to teach us how to respect people you disagree with, and help us to really kind of see the differences, to come to truth and accept those moral things. And my second question, if I may, to
Please.
just be brief, is also as far as is concerned with the future of machine learning and things of that nature. Do you think that ultimately this technology is going to basically uncover and learn everything we've already uncovered in the modern age with those philosophers and the sort? Thanks a bunch, guys.
Wonderful, Chris. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, folks, if you have any more questions, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. And we're going to start, I'm going to give about 10 seconds. If somebody else wants to put the questions on the table, you can continue to put exclamation marks. I will incorporate questions as we go on. Let's start with Chris's question on the role of encyclicals. What is the role of encyclicals going forward?
I think what we have all observed here, the Pope didn't have to spend a day at the Russian embassy to remind us of the moral responsibility of the church. We will later on get into a session specifically directed to the work of Victor Gaiten in diplomacy. But as a very long-standing and well-respected, particularly in diplomatic fields, and I think likely as the whole abuse scandal and so forth question is put in perspective properly, the moral responsibility of the church winds up effectively rising to the top. And so we may have discussed Edgar Allan Poe's 1891 short story, Descent into the Maelstrom. This topic comes up enough that I think it's worth taking a look at. It's a very short story. And for those of you who are familiar with it, you know what a maelstrom is. A maelstrom is an upside down tornado. It's in the water. And these are very real and very dangerous. And so it's a story about a ship that winds up being trapped in a maelstrom, and how do you survive? So the question of how, we're all having the same question. How are we going to survive the apparently chaotic world in which we live? You don't need to read the headlines. You don't need to watch CNN to know how really seriously foobarred the entire situation is at this point. If you don't know what foobar, F-U-B-A-R, means, it's got its own Wikipedia page. So we all know this. We don't have to even just have a gut feeling. We know in very conscious sense that this is not the world we want to live in. This is a maelstrom. And so I'll spoil the story for you perhaps by noting, and McLuhan actually used this story extensively. And indeed, there's a documentary on his life in which this is the main metaphor, the question of the maelstrom. We're going to have to grab a hold of something. I'm not here evangelizing for the Catholic Church. I appreciate that there may be Catholics, there may be converts who come and listen to all of this, but that is not my point here. My point here is to get you to much more carefully and deliberately try to answer that question for yourself. How are we to live under these circumstances? What is it that we're going to grab a hold of? And so the role of the encyclicals is a historic track of how the church has tried to answer that question. None of them fall under the category of papal infallibility. This is not something that the Pope is issuing with that sort of authority behind it. It is in fact something that can be and often is ignored. And yet we have here a track of history, of which there's a great deal more than what I've presented today, which should helpfully provide us with some clues whether we want the Catholic Church to be in a significant role. We're going to learn a great deal on these encyclicals. So what we're all trying to do here, I suspect, every single person, is trying to answer the question, how are we going to survive the maelstrom? So my answer is the encyclicals is one set of guideposts. And we'll look forward to everybody's thoughts about that and perhaps suggestion of alternatives.
Wonderful. Next is Joe's question about whether this is right or left, or whether
Right.
some of
Right.
the groups have used this more than others. Go ahead.
Right. So that's a great question. And as you have correctly noted, the fact that Catholic social teaching, which is neither right nor left, has been described as the greatest secret of the Catholic Church, should indicate to you that people are reluctant to pursue an approach which is neither left nor right. So indeed, your description is correct. In particular, the whole question of liberation theology, which specifically was an enormous force, and I think in some places still is, in Latin America, as well as elsewhere. It turns out that Pope Francis was, he was in the fire, he was in the kettle, he was in the middle of all of this stuff. So those of you who have not seen it, if you have a chance, the movie Two Popes is a very interesting description of the encounter between the now retired emeritus Pope Benedict XVI, or if you will, B16, and Francis. Francis had come to Rome to resign, and that declaration on his part, of course, was rejected. But what got him to that point was his disgust, really, in fighting the battle in Argentina. That battle involved the Jesuits emphatically. He is himself a Jesuit. There was a dirty war going on. People were dying as a result of these differences. This is not a dorm room debate. This is very serious life and death matter. And so what has happened, the way I would summarize it today, is that Francis came, when he came to Rome and ultimately took on the role as Pope, he tried to make this neither left nor right a real serious principle, an emphatic principle. And what do you think happened? Everybody hated him. Because people tend to want to affiliate in one direction or another politically, because this overlay of, if you will, secular politics on church matters is extremely difficult to resist, particularly under television conditions. So here I'm bringing this back to the fundamental, and we'll talk about these environments in some more detail as we go through the rest of the course. But the world that we have all lived in, that now apparently chaotic maelstrom, is a world that has been detached in many important respects from reality. And in that detaching from reality, the movement from reality to fantasy, that dramatically emphasizes these political positions. So my best guess is that we'll never completely get rid of that, but we will find more and more people, and you see this in political terms, where third ways are being proposed and where alternatives, it's not capitalist, it's not socialist, it's an alternative. We'll get into this in some detail in subsidiarity. And so my suspicion is, and in fact, people in this meetup and others we're talking with will play an important role, I think, in this. We will move past that distinction, but today's church is still filled with television people, if you will. and they have very often picked sides. And one of the questions that came up last week was whether or not the current leadership of the Catholic Church is prepared to step into this responsibility. My answer was probably not. The amount of energy that goes into expressing your ideological views and in combat with other people about this is still very strong. Overcoming that will be difficult, and indeed may fail. And yet the rest of us will then be responsible, however this turns out, for making sure that the moral order, which is neither left nor right, winds up being something we express in our private lives and our social lives. Joe, great question, and you're absolutely right. This continues to be a problem.
Wonderful. Next question is by Peter. Peter, go ahead.
Oh, whoa. I thought there was another question.
No,
before,
I'm trying to organize all the questions. I'm assuming that your question will be more general, so go ahead.
I see. Well, yeah, my question was actually a follow-up to Joseph's, which is, you know, it's been reiterated a bunch that Catholic social teaching is, you know, in this framework, deliberately neither left-wing nor right-wing. But does that mean, Mark, are we saying then that it is a centrist approach, or are we saying something else?
Well, should I answer that, Shrikant?
Please, go ahead.
Okay. The answer is no. Centrist tends to be that position in modern politics, which is trying to compromise with everybody. And so, at least as centrist is understood in the modern political sphere, which tends to be one of those I can see what the good part in what you're saying, the good part in what you're saying. I'm suggesting, in fact, that a breakthrough is needed. So to describe the medieval sensibility, which is what I'm trying to convey here, and I will do that best of my abilities over the rest of the course, that is not in the center of anything modern. If by centrist you mean what the moderns describe as in the center, medieval doesn't fit on this chart. It's not on the left-wing, right-wing spectrum. The reason why Catholic social teaching is neither left nor right is because it's not modern. So the sensibility here is probably going to wind up, if you will, with a new version of a left wing and a right wing.
Let me ask a follow-up question to that, because I mean, I really like the terms kind of common ground, you know, like the common things. So I think when you look at Aquinas, right, and what is it that Aquinas adds to this debate is that he is directing our attention to fundamental nature of human beings. And so instead of talking at the level of politics and social conflict as is understood today, we are going and saying, what kind of beings are human beings? And you're going back to basics, got back to the core of who we are as human beings and who we are as a community, and kind of starting back from there. Is that what you're talking about in that sense, that it is common?
Yes. The way out of the maelstrom is not to take a compromised position because your life is being threatened. The way to deal with the chaos that we are all now experiencing is to look for something which is literally not on the map. And your emphasis in particular of the common nature of humanity and its social relations is something that has largely been set aside by modern social science. So for those of you who may have bothered to go to the CSDL website, which is digitallife.center, you may have noticed all the way over on the right-hand side, this tab called About Us. The first bullet there is called Mission. And embedded within that is the notion that we're in a paradigm shift and therefore we need new sciences. So you will hear more about this in the rest of the course, but not only do we need new psychology, we need new sociology, we need not a false, but a true anthropology, as was described in the encyclical. And all of that is going to wind up overturning a lot of apple carts. To return to the sensibility we're describing here and the understanding of human beings and society, that is not something that you will find on the current spectrum. And in particular, in answering Pete's question, it's not the center between these two poles. But to further elaborate here, and Peter knows this quite well, and as you might imagine, underlying a lot of what we're describing here is the work of Aristotle. So in this regard, and when I get to the point of assembling tomorrow a bibliography for today, I hope I put Aristotle's Politics on that list. He did not describe the correct or best political situation as being in the center, but I think perhaps what Peter was asking about would be more a question of moderation. And so the toning down of the left-right extremes, the recognition that these are mad fantasies, the recognition that we have been driven to really quite useless descriptions of the situation, and ultimately, particularly with the digital sphere, quite dangerous and absurd solutions, because we've lost what it means to be human. So there is a sense in which we're looking for is a balance. So I guess I would suggest that the notion of balance is something we need to explore more, and probably also, as Peter's suggesting, distinguish balance from what appears to be the center or the centrist position.
Wonderful. Next, let's take up Chris's question. I'm going to broaden it. Is the solution going to be AI or machine learning, mastering some of these things and helping us with that? What do you think?
In a strange way, yes. Maybe not so strange. What's happened to us, what's gotten us into this mess, was our willful ignoring of the character of human beings. And machine learning, in many fundamental ways, forces us to remember. So as we've described it, and we'll be talking about in later courses here, the shift from a paradigm based on fantasy, which has all of these extremes, left, right, and other dimensions, including human and post-human and so forth. All of that, the imbalance associated with all of that, the extreme associated with all of that, is going to need to be addressed here. And so in fact, machine learning drives human beings to remember what it means to be human. Now, if the question was, are the robots going to figure out everything that humans have figured out? Are the robots going to replace the humans? The answer to that question is no. Machines are dead. Machines have no soul. We are not going to be uploading our consciousness into immortal machines. That's not going to happen. But what I believe is going to happen is the enormous amount of effort. So I don't think anybody quite knows the total amount of money being spent on this topic. But if you just take the major militaries of the world and their effort to replace human soldiers with machines, and a lot of this probably actually is being done in classified settings, although the way this research is done nowadays is that there's a classified backdrop to a lot of the public material, is that there's an incredible superpower conflict underway now. Try to figure out how to replace human beings with machines. Machine learning will not solve that problem, as the people who are doing machine learning themselves know very well. But there are many attempts at breakthroughs. There are many attempts at other approaches that might somehow get us past these limitations. It is that pursuit and its public expression, therefore the recognition and a wider audience of what's going on here, which is by no means thorough yet. Henry Kissinger is an outstanding figure in many respects. He's an old man. He's a frail man. Any day now, we're going to pick up the newspaper and Henry Kissinger will no longer be with us, along with the Queen of England and a number of other people who cannot go on forever. But Henry Kissinger's recognition that we live in an age of AI is a very important observation by a critical individual. Many others around him do not know that. So I'll just for a moment single out David Brooks, for instance. So David Brooks can write these extensive essays in the Atlantic magazine about the mess that we're in and the mistakes that he made with the Bobos and so forth. Nowhere in that is the recognition that what is driving this is this shift towards AI. The age of AI compels humans to remember what it means to be human. And for that reason, I would answer yes. Machine learning is, in fact, a significant part of how we will get out of this maelstrom, which we're now all living.
Wonderful. Next question is, let me make it more general. The slide says that church must speak out on social issues. What is the range of social issues? Does it include, population control? Does it? What's the range of social issues?
Right. Well, the term that is used in Quadragesimo anno in the subtitle is social order. So what you will, to the extent that we can imagine the world to be in a conflict between order and chaos, which is probably not the right way to view things, but we will fall into that view nonetheless. It is the expression of moral order that is the church's responsibility. Now, how does moral order apply in this situation, that situation? The church's answer here, of course, is this is not situational ethics. The answer to that question is not, well, it depends. The answer to that question is not, well, let's take a vote. From the church's standpoint, moral order is natural law. It is something that applies under all circumstances. So as we all know, the church's stance on human dignity, which will be the topic of the next two sessions, is enormously focused on the question of abortion. So as those who have followed the topic of population control know, abortion is probably the single most significant tool used to limit population growth. China was the obvious major example of this with their one-child policy. That meant, and I think still probably means to this day, that China has remarkable numbers of abortions. compared to the rest of the world. And I can well understand that there are people on this call who are still concerned that overpopulation, which was a much hyped threat going back into the 60s and 70s, stories of population bombs and so forth, none of which proved to be the case, still needs to be sorted out. But from the standpoint of the church, and from the standpoint of natural law, which, by the way, has a variety of interpretations. The current interpretation is that human life begins at conception. That has not always been the view. And in particular, it was not the view of Thomas Aquinas. So as we sort this out, are we in danger of running out of food? Are we in danger of running out of land and other resources? My very strong suspicion is the answer to that is no. We'll probably wind up leveling off. In fact, we're already well into a leveling off process. The S-curve of human population will probably level off around 9 billion. I do believe that can be done in such a way that we don't all poison ourselves. And so my best answer to the question of population control is the advice that I have given in multiple settings, particularly with young people. And what I say to them is, it's up to you now. Have some babies. And I'm hoping there are some people here on this call who have made that decision as well.
Thank you, Mark. Can you tell us about what's coming up next week? A little bit of preview.
Yes. So the organization of the rest of this course, there's 6 more sessions, are 2 on each of the 3 pillar topics of Catholic social teaching. Human dignity, next week and the week after. Subsidiarity, following that. Solidarity, following that. This will bring us through Easter Sunday. What we're going to start next week doing is to put the larger topic of human dignity in perspective. We will follow that, and this will be the pattern for each of these pairs, is we'll spend the first session on the fundamentals, human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity. Then we'll spend the second week session on how is this uniquely modified under digital conditions. So the answer I just gave about human beings remembering what it means to be human will be week after next. We'll drill down in more detail about that. But next week, we're going to talk about the human person. We're going to talk about what it means to be a human as opposed to a machine. Then we'll carry that forward into the session after that. So we have 6 more weeks to go. I appreciate very much your participation, your patience, and hand it back to Shrikant.
Wonderful. And folks, I've put the link to the Scribal Hyperbook for this course. This course is designed so that you can interact with it after the meetups. So before the meetups, during the meetups, and after the meetups. So before the meetups, we'll put up the slides a couple of days beforehand, so you can see the questions that are going to be discussed, all the points that are going to be made. During the meetup, you can go ahead and put the comments. After the meetup, you can go ahead and continue putting questions and comments on it. We'll put up the video. We're going to break up the video by questions, so you can jump to it. There will be slides there. Most importantly, there will be detailed bibliography, so you can follow up and research on any of the topics that Mark is talking about. And my favorite part is Peter Berkman's lecture notes. He does a fantastic job of taking next lecture notes, and both kind of capturing key points that were made as well as his own thoughts. So please go ahead. I put the link in there. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I had offered to Victor Gaitan before we started today that if he wanted to say a few words about his recent book, God's Diplomats.
Please go ahead, Victor.
we will have, we'll hear more from Victor later on, but just to give him the opportunity to tee this up. I've read the book. I've given it a very high review. It's actually quite remarkable. Peter's now reading the book. So if you want a recently published book by someone who is participating in this series, Victor's book would be the right place to start. If you'd like to say a few words, Victor.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And thank you, Peter, again, for your comments. Yes, I, without knowing that I was going to follow, to be exposed to Mark's high understanding and masterly presentation of what is the implicitly Vatican diplomacy stemming from the natural law and from the function of Vatican diplomacy, which is morality through discernment and reality of events. So to me, it is it is further reassurance that I attempted to do the right thing by publishing this book, and I don't feel lonely anymore. At times, the different reviewers, they were asking me almost the same question. How did you come to take the stand against the United States? Or more recently, why isn't Pope Francis criticizing Putin and the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church? Well, throughout the history, the most recent century, no Pope has criticized a tyrant. Why? First of all, that is not the function of a pontiff. The function, pretty much, if I could say, of a pope and his diplomacy is to assess, to bring reality to, in order to make some kind of a engage in dialogue with the tyrant, even as very clearly, very succinctly, Pius XI has stated, as he engaged into dialogue with Mussolini in order to come to signing the Lateran Treaty, which recognized the state of the Vatican City, which allowed the Vatican to continue its diplomacy even more than it has done until then without a recognized state. Now, in the present conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as we know, Pope Francis, in an unprecedented historic way, went to the Russian embassy to the Holy See. Now, what I believe is important is, and it's missing always, is what it required in order for Pope Francis to go to the to be accepted, to be permitted to go to the Russian territory. That is Russian territory, the Russian embassy at the Holy See at the Vatican. That required two things. First, that he be invited by the Russian state, which most likely was through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, and just as importantly, be invited by the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, Kirill. So when the Russian state and the Patriarchy of Russia agreed to permit the Holy Father to go to Russian territory to talk to the Russian ambassador to the Holy See, that meant that both President Putin and the Patriarch were willing to listen to the Pope, and they did. the Holy Father stayed for more than 1 hour at the Russian embassy at the Vatican. And then what did Francis do after coming out from the Russian embassy? He called President Zelensky of Ukraine. Why did Zelensky took the Pope's call, knowing that he's coming out from the Russian embassy? Because he wanted to hear the Pope and the Pope's presentation and the Pope's encouragement. So this is a major, it fits right into Marx's presentation, that the Vatican, what the Vatican does is not to take sides and not even to get in the middle, to present a so-called centrist view, but to listen and to express its centuries-long thinking, which stems again from the natural law. So I believe that that is a lesson, or should be another lesson for the diplomats from the secular states, which engage into condemnations and sanctions and more weapons. Exactly what the teaching of the Catholic Church have been always criticizing. And in particular, Pope Francis, even before he became Pope, he was criticizing the armament, the military complex, the intelligence complex, and now he is facing it straight on. Now, yes, very difficult times. We are, as Mark has so clearly presented it, we are entering a different era, which is somehow unavoidable. There will be different laws, different psychology, different sociology, all these sciences that have been written in the past 200 years. We know in clarity of assessment, we could conclude that they are no longer representing reality. So I don't know if I answered your question, but or the distinguished audience that.
It's extremely helpful, and I'm sure everybody here has been drawn into many conversations about, in particular, the horrendous, always horrendous, war situation, as well as its various predicates and so forth. But it really is a pleasure, Victor, to hear a very clear view about how this situation and many others I think we're going to be facing need to be dealt with. And here I'm again recommending, and you'll find in the chat, Joe's been very helpful. You'll find Victor's book. I encourage you all to buy it and to review it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Victor, it's an honor and real thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. And folks, Victor is going to be back as a guest on session 7. That's on April 10th on Solidarity, God's Diplomats. So there he will be able to talk about his book and his understanding of the God's Diplomats at length. Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, everybody. See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.